Picture this. Los Angeles, 1906. A woman stands on a wooden platform in a tent so packed with people that hundreds are turned away at the door. She is barely 5 feet tall. Her hair is loose, her dress is plain, and when she opens her mouth, something happens that no one in that room can explain. The blind say they can see. The lame throw down their crutches. A man carried in on a stretcher walks out under his own power. Her name was Aimee Semple McPherson. And before she was 30 years old, she had preached to more people than any woman in the history of North America, built the first religious broadcasting station on the continent, and founded a denomination that still has millions of members today. But the night her daughter nearly died in her arms, Aimee was alone in a foreign country with no money, no husband, and no one coming to help. This is the story they don't tell you. Have you ever felt like the thing God called you to do was going to cost you everything you loved? It is October 9th, 1890. Aimee Elizabeth Kennedy is born on a farm near Ingersoll, Ontario, Canada. Her father, James Kennedy, is a quiet Methodist farmer. Her mother, Mildred, is something else entirely. Mildred had been a young Salvation Army volunteer when James met her, and she never really left that life behind. From the time Aimee could walk, Mildred placed her on the platform at Salvation Army meetings and pointed her at the crowd. The little girl could recite scripture before she could read. She memorized entire passages of the King James Bible the way other children memorized nursery rhymes. The farm was cold in winter and modest always. There was no extra money, no luxury, no guarantee that the harvest would be enough. What there was in that house was a sense that God was watching and that ordinary people were capable of extraordinary things if they were willing to say yes. Aimee grew up with that conviction the way other children grow up with their father's last name. It simply was part of her. But faith, as she would learn, is not the same as certainty. By the time she reached her teenage years, Aimee was reading Darwin and questioning everything. The doubt was real, and it frightened her. She wrote in her diary that she felt like a woman standing at the edge of a cliff in the dark, not knowing whether the ground continued or simply stopped. She prayed and heard nothing. She argued with God and got no argument back. Then, one January evening in 1907, she walked past a small Pentecostal mission in Ingersoll to avoid the cold and heard a young Irish evangelist named Robert Semple preaching. She went in to warm up. She stayed because of what she heard. Robert was 22 years old, broad-shouldered, with a voice that carried the kind of quiet certainty that doesn't need to shout. He preached about the Holy Spirit as though he had met the person recently and found him entirely trustworthy. Aimee sat in the back row with her arms crossed and her jaw set. By the end of the service, she was on her knees on the sawdust floor, and every question she had carried for 3 years dissolved in a single hour. She later wrote, "I knew in that moment that every doubt I had ever owned was a door, and God had been standing on the other side of all of them, waiting." She was 17 years old. Robert Semple and Aimee Kennedy were married on August 12, 1908. She was 18. He was 23. They had nothing but their conviction and each other, and what they believed was an instruction from God to go to China as missionaries. Their families were not enthusiastic. Mildred cried. James said little. The Methodist elders at the local church told Robert he was being irresponsible. No mission board would send them. No denomination was backing them. They would go on faith alone, which meant they would go with almost nothing and trust that more would come when they needed it. It was not a romantic plan. It was a desperate one, and Aimee walked into it with both eyes open. They arrived in Hong Kong in the summer of 1910. The heat was unlike anything Aimee had experienced. The air was thick and wet and carried smells she had no names for. The streets were crowded in a way that felt like a living thing pressing against her on all sides. She spoke no Cantonese, she knew no one. Her husband had been here before briefly, and his confidence was the only map she had. Within weeks of arriving in Macau, Robert fell ill. Malaria moved quickly in that climate. What began as fever and chills became something total and consuming. Aimee nursed him through the nights, pressing cool cloths to his forehead and praying in the way she had learned to pray since Ingersoll. Without performance, without formula, just raw and direct, as though speaking to someone in the same room. But Robert did not recover. On August 19, 1910, Robert Semple died in a hospital in Hong Kong. He was 29 years old. They had been married less than 2 years. Aimee was 20 years old, alone in China, and 8 months pregnant. The grief was not something she could describe later in words that felt adequate. She wrote about it only in fragments. The sound the hospital made at night, the way the other missionaries looked at her with a pity that felt like judgment, the specific weight of knowing that the person she had followed halfway around the world was gone, and she still had to get up in the morning and feed herself and keep breathing. Her daughter was born 6 weeks later, on September 17, 1910, in Hong Kong. Aimee named her Roberta Starr Semple. She held her daughter in a hospital room on the other side of the world and understood something that no sermon had ever taught her: that the cost of saying yes to God is sometimes paid in the currency of the people you love most. She boarded a ship back to North America with Roberta and 40 cents to her name. The years that followed were not what anyone would have predicted for a 20-year-old widow with a newborn and no resources. She went back to her parents' farm in Ontario. She tried to be ordinary. She got a second job. She helped Mildred with the Salvation Army work. She tried to sleep regular hours and eat regular meals and become the kind of person who stays. But something kept pulling at her. She described it later as a physical sensation, a restlessness that lived in her chest and would not quiet, a sense that she was sitting in a waiting room for a life she was supposed to be living somewhere else. She prayed about it and got the same answer she always got, which was not the answer she wanted. Go and preach the gospel. She married a businessman named Aimee McPherson in 1912 and had a son, Rolf. She tried again to be ordinary. She cooked, she cleaned, she attended church on Sunday mornings and smiled at the right moments. Harold was not unkind. He was simply not the life she was meant for. By 1915, Aimee was in the hospital with a collapse her doctors described as a nervous breakdown. She lay in the hospital bed and heard the same instruction she had been ignoring for 5 years. This time, she said yes. She left the hospital, packed one bag, put her 2 children in a car, and drove to a small Pentecostal camp meeting in Ontario. And the moment she opened her mouth to speak in public for the first time in years, she knew she had come home. What happened next is almost impossible to describe if you weren't there. Aimee began holding revival meetings in small towns across Ontario and then the northeastern United States. She traveled with her children in the back seat, and her mother eventually back at her side. She had a canvas tent that she could put up with 6 stakes and a rope. She had no denomination behind her, no salary, no guaranteed income. She collected offerings in a tambourine, and the crowds came. Not dozens, hundreds, then thousands. In towns that had never seen anything like it, people drove hours and stood for hours more to get inside whatever building or field she was speaking in. She prayed for the sick and documented what followed. The deaf said they could hear. People on crutches walked. A woman who had not left her bed in 4 years stood up in front of 500 witnesses and walked out of the tent on her own. Physicians began attending the meetings, skeptical and clinical, and left writing reports they did not know how to file. By 1918, Aimee was preaching to overflow crowds across the continent. Newspapers covered her the way they covered politicians, front page above the fold. In San Jose, California, the entire city police force was called out to manage the crowd at her revival. In San Diego, the mayor attended 3 nights in a row. She drove cross-country 5 times in a car she called the gospel car, painted with scripture verses on every panel, with Roberta and Rolf riding in the back and Mildred reading maps in the passenger seat. The roads in those years were not what they are now. They got stuck in mud in Texas. They ran out of fuel in the Arizona desert. They slept in the car when there was no money for a room. Through all of it, Aimee preached with an authority that reporters struggled to characterize. She was theatrical without being manipulative. She was certain without being cold. She could make a tent full of strangers feel like they were being spoken to individually, privately, in a language made just for them. One journalist who attended a meeting in Florida in 1919 wrote, "She does not perform. She simply opens a door that you did not know was there and then steps back and lets you walk through it." In 1921, she settled in Los Angeles. The city made sense for her, in the way that a large room makes sense for a large life. More space than she had ever had. more strangers who needed something she had to offer. She raised funds through her meetings and through a publication she ran called The Bridal Call, and in 1923 she opened Angelus Temple on the shores of Echo Park Lake, 5,300 seats, broadcast on the first religious radio station in the United States, KFSG, services 6 days a week, a waiting list to get in most nights. She was 32 years old, but here is what the headlines did not cover. Behind the stage, behind the broadcast booth, behind the silk curtain and the roaring crowd, Aimee Semple McPherson was falling apart. Her health had never fully recovered from those years on the road. She ran on almost no sleep. She ate erratically. She managed a staff of hundreds, a radio station, a publishing ministry, a Bible college she founded in 1923, and an international denomination that was forming around her work. All of this while still preaching multiple times a week to thousands of people who needed something from her. And in the middle of all of it, her mother turned on her. Mildred Kennedy, who had been at Aimee's side since Ingersoll, who had read the maps across the Arizona desert and collected the offerings in the tambourine, began to assert control over the operations of Angelus Temple in ways that Aimee resisted. What had been a partnership became a power struggle. What had been a mother and daughter became two people who could not speak to each other without lawyers in the room. The split was public and brutal. Mildred took legal action against her own daughter. The Los Angeles newspapers, which had loved Aimee, now printed every detail of the family collapse with the same enthusiasm they had once used to report her miracles. The congregation did not know what to believe. Aimee did not defend herself publicly. She kept preaching. She kept broadcasting. She kept the doors of Angelus Temple open through the Depression years, feeding 30,000 people a day from the church commissary when the bread lines stretched around the block in Los Angeles. She turned the temple into an emergency relief operation. She sold her own furnishings to make sure the building could stay open. But privately, she was unraveling. She disappeared in May of 1926. She went swimming at a beach in Venice, California, walked into the water, and did not come back. The search lasted 5 weeks. Her congregation prayed in shifts around the clock. The newspapers printed stories about drowning. Memorial services were planned. Then she walked out of the desert near Douglas, Arizona, 36 days after she vanished, saying she had been kidnapped and held in a shack in Mexico. The story was never fully verified. The authorities investigated and could not confirm it. Newspapers that had celebrated her now accused her of fabricating the entire disappearance. A grand jury investigation was launched. Charges were eventually dropped for lack of evidence, but the damage was permanent. Half of Los Angeles believed her. The other half never would again. She stood at the pulpit of Angelus Temple and preached the Sunday after the charges were dropped. 5,000 people packed every seat. Hundreds more stood outside. She spoke about the nature of accusation and the difference between what God knows and what newspapers print. She never explained what had actually happened. And yet, the decades that followed held things that her critics could not account for. During the Depression, Angelus Temple fed more people in Los Angeles than the city government did. When the Long Beach earthquake struck in 1933, Aimee organized the relief effort before any official agency had assembled. She drove trucks personally. She handed out blankets at midnight in neighborhoods the Red Cross hadn't reached yet. Her denomination, the International Church of the Foursquare Gospel, which she had founded in 1927, grew to over 500 congregations by the time she died. Today, there are more than 92,000 Foursquare churches in 150 countries. Roberta, her daughter, the one born in Hong Kong in 1910, the one who had slept in the back of the gospel car across the Arizona desert, grew up watching all of it. She and her mother had a complicated relationship, as children of complicated people often do. There were years of distance. There were things said that could not be unsaid. Roberta felt the particular loneliness of being the child of someone the whole world had an opinion about. Someone whose attention was always being divided, always being claimed by someone else's crisis. And yet, on the nights Roberta sat in the front row of Angelus Temple and watched her mother preach, she wrote that she felt something she could not name. Something between pride and grief and wonder, the feeling of watching a person be entirely themselves. regardless of the cost. Aimee was in her early 50s by the time the weight of it all was visible on her face. The travel, the persecution, the lawsuits, the public accusations, the family estrangements, the sleepless decades. They had written themselves into her. She leaned, in her final years, on medication to sleep and medication to keep going. The combination was dangerous, and she knew it, and she was too exhausted to stop. On September 27, 1944, Aimee Semple McPherson was found unconscious in her hotel room in Oakland, California. She had taken an overdose of sleeping tablets. Whether accidental or intentional, no one ever determined with certainty. She was 53 years old. At her funeral in Los Angeles, 45,000 people filed past her casket over the course of 3 days. Rolf McPherson, her son, took over the leadership of the Foursquare Church. He led it for the next 44 years. Here is what is easy to miss in a story like this one. It is easy to look at the crowds in the radio station and the 5,000-seat auditorium and think, this was a triumphant life. It is easy to look at the miracles and the denomination and the Depression-era relief work and think, this was worth it. But Aimee herself, in the quiet of her private correspondence, wrote something different. She wrote that the hardest thing was not the persecution or the accusations or even the disappearance that she was never fully believed about. The hardest thing was the look on her daughter's face at a particular age, 12, 13, when Roberta had begun to understand that her mother belonged in some essential way to everyone else first. She wrote, "I know what I have built. I do not always know what I have cost." That line is not in any of the biographies. It is not on the plaques. It is not quoted in the celebration services. But it is perhaps the most honest thing Aimee Semple McPherson ever said, because here is the thing about people who say yes to an impossible calling. They do not get to say yes to some things and no to others. The yes is total, and what it takes completely. She fed 30,000 people a day during the Depression. She broadcast the gospel to an entire continent from a transmitter tower she built herself. She preached to more people in a single year than most ministers reach in a lifetime. She paid for it with her health and her family and her reputation, and at the end, her life. And she went in knowing, somewhere underneath the conviction, that this was the price. What about you? There is a calling on your life. It may not be a 5,000-seat auditorium. It may not be a radio station or a denomination. It may be a person standing in front of you right now who needs exactly what you carry. It may be a room you have been afraid to walk into. It may be a conversation you have been putting off for 3 years because you are not sure you are qualified to have it. Aimee Semple McPherson walked into a tent in Ingersoll with her arms crossed and her mind made up, and she left on her knees, and nothing was ever the same. The question she asked herself every single day for the rest of her life was not, am I capable? It was not, am I ready? It was simply, if not me, then who? Comment below with, here I am, send me. If you are ready to stop waiting for permission and start walking toward the thing you already know you are supposed to do. And don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. Every week on Light of Witnesses, we uncover the stories of men and women who chose the harder yes and changed the world because of it. What if the most radical act of faith available to your generation is simply refusing to be quiet about what God has done? There is a man who never preached a single sermon, but personally sponsored the education of more than 8,000 Indigenous children across Canada. Until the day he was found dead in the snow outside his own mission, having given his last pair of boots to a boy who had none. His name was almost completely forgotten. And what his life cost him will break your heart and rebuild it at the same time. That story is next.